It's now time for the Billy C. Show, part of the BillyCBoxing.com network.
And we're coming to you live from the Billy C. Studios in Lake George, New York. I'm Bill Caligiero. It's time for the Billy C. Show. Good morning, good day, good evening, whenever you're watching, whenever you're listening. I hope you're doing okay today. Today's show is being brought to us in part by the Title Bout Championship computer game. Get yourself a copy right now. Visit our website, BillyCBoxing.com, and click on the Title Bout banner. Today's show is also being brought to us in part by the Southern Gourmet Spice Company. That's right. If you're looking for the best barbecue rub, check out Kenny Bear's. If you're looking for the best seasoned salt, check out Kenny Bear's seasoned salt. And if you're looking for the best Cajun spice, and also my personal favorite, check out Kenny Bear's Cajun spice. Get it all at southerngourmetspice.com. That's southerngourmetspice.com. And make sure you tell them Billy C sent you. And while you're at it, demand the Billy C discount. Today's show is also being brought to us in part, you guessed it, by my book. Tom Molyneux, From Bondage to Baddest Man on the Planet, is available right now where all good books are sold. And you can get a copy of this book while you're watching or listening to this show. Like right now. Like, do it. Just visit Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. Or if you're looking to get a signed copy, no problem. Just drop me an email, bill@BillyCBoxing.com. Today's show, we're going to focus on former world heavyweight champion and boxing Hall of Famer and a fighter who many regard as one of the greatest ever, one of my personal favorite fighters, the late, great Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was a heavyweight. He was born in Galveston, Texas. His nickname, the Galveston Giant, which is interesting because if you look at Jack Johnson, he was considered a giant of his era. But when you look at the stats, he was 6 foot tall, 6 foot 1/2 inches tall. He did have a long reach, 74-inch reach. Here's the thing, if you punch him up on BoxRec, you'll see that his career record on BoxRec states 54 wins, 34 coming by knockout, 11 of his losses where he was stopped 6 times. He drew 9 times. And he fought a total of 77 fights. However, back in the day that Jack Johnson fought, there were a lot of things called like a newspaper decision, or boxing wasn't legal in a lot of states, so they would render no decision. So there's many different records that are posted. For example, there's one that many people believe is true as well. 68 wins, 11 losses, 10 draws. Then you have the old 92 wins, 12 losses, 14 draws, and a couple of no decisions. I like to go by the International Boxing Hall of Fame's record that they have posted, which is 77 wins, 13 losses, 14 draws, 48 of his wins coming by knockout. He had a total of 123 fights. He also had a bunch of no decisions. Here's the thing. When you look at Jack Johnson and the first thing that jumps out is, somebody's going to say, well, if he was so big and everything, he only had 48 knockouts in 123 fights. Well, Jack Johnson, we touched on a little bit last week. He toyed with his opponents. He literally toyed with his opponents. He was so much better than everyone else at that time. And when you take a look at his record, he did fight a bunch of fighters, that Hall of Famers and what have you, and we'll get into that in a second when the guys join me. But there's one fight in particular that I always look at. It took place early in his career, back right after the turn of the century. No, not 2000, 1900. It happened in 1901, February 25th to be exact. My brother's birthday, except he was born substantially years later. But February 25th, 1901, he fought Joe Choinski in Texas, and he lost. He was knocked out. in 3 rounds of a scheduled 20 rounder. But here's the thing: the fight was rushed, and both of these guys got arrested because they were fighting it was illegal to fight, and they were both in jail. Well, during the time they were doing time together, they became pretty close, and Joe Chowinski actually taught Jack Johnson a lot about boxing, about defense specifically. And when they fought some exhibitions while they were in jail, and they were actually treated like royalty at that time in his life. And he learned a lot from Joe Chowinski. As a matter of fact, Joe Chowinski worked his corner for a couple of fights, and I think that a lot of credit has to be given to Chowinski during that time. Speaking of times, Jack Johnson fought during Black Crow America. It was terrible. And this was one of the things that made Jack Johnson Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson hated the fact of people looking down on him or treating him differently because of the color of his skin. We're going to get back to that in a second. But joining me right now is my man Alex Papali. And in a second, we're going to have Daxx Khan. He looks like he's having some difficulties with his setup here. But what's up, Alex?
Good evening, Billy C. How are you?
I'm doing good. Jack Johnson, man, what's your thoughts? You good? Hold on, Dax, are you good? Thumbs up if you're good. It looks like Dax having some issues. But go ahead. Your quick thoughts on Jack Johnson.
Definitely one of my favorites. I remember, early in my my exposure to boxing, once I got interested in boxing, learning about him, and it's one of those stories where some of it doesn't even seem real. Like, this happened. We're coming up on the especially the 4th of July stuff. The Jim Jeffries fight, just an amazing part of American history. An incredible person, cultural figure, and fighter. Definitely one of my favorites. I love heavyweights, so it's hard not to be a big fan. Yes, in terms of he learned so much from that Chowinski fight, and then the lockup together with him. That's just an amazing aspect of this whole era with the color line, which is what this was sort of referred to, where in a lot of places, mixed race bouts with one fighter was of African descent and the other white, was just plain outlawed in a lot of places. And that was one of the reasons why there was no boxing, and the cops rousted the whole fight and arrested a bunch of people, arrested the boxers too. And that's how Chowinski and Johnson end up in jail. There's a great photo of it, and they were treated like kings.
They were. It's funny. I was watching this movie recently, and I can see Dax's camera shot, but it looks like he's still having some issues there. But let me just see if I can get him on. Daxx, you good? No sound. How about now?
Man, can you hear me?
Yeah. All right. We got you. Glad you. But I saw this movie.
I had to go out to the airport, so it's not at my regular computer. So.
Yeah. You're breaking up, and we're losing your sound here and there. But we'll make it work. But I was watching this movie not too long ago, and it was actually Errol Flynn was in it, and he was playing he was playing James Corbett, and there was a scene in there which you just made me think of, Alex, where he's in a fight and it's illegal, and all of the top people, all the political people were at the fight. And when they all got arrested, they're in there and it's like, oh, Judge so-and-so, he's like, oh, they were fighting. They were, and it's like he wasn't there. And it was kind of comical because although it was a movie, that's exactly what used to take place. But Daxx, your quick thoughts on Jack Johnson before we dive in.
Jack Johnson was well ahead of his time. He was, aside from Jim Crow America, the country itself was going through a transition, remember?
Yeah, Daxx is all frozen up here now. So like we said, I apologize for that. He's not at his normal studio. So hopefully we can get him back at some point. But Alex, I'm sorry. One of the knocks on Jack Johnson was that some people will tell me, oh, he didn't fight anybody. When you look at his record, I guess it's tough to really, because it was so long ago, I guess it's tough. And the fact that, you were coming from the transition of the bare knuckle era, pretty much still to the gloved era. And a lot of the fighters that transitioned, you got to be careful with that word these days, but that transitioned from the bare knuckles is what I'm talking about to the gloved era. They started not counting some of those previous fights that they had. So when you look at his record and you see some of these guys with hardly any fights, like the guys that stick out for me is a shirt that you had. And I'm trying to remember if I ever got a copy of it or not, but I don't think you gave it to me. All you did was ask me. But Sam McVeigh, he was a guy that fought Jack Johnson several times, and it sticks out at me that he had 6 fights in 1903 when he fought Johnson, and he had substantially more.
Yeah, he had beaten Sam McVeigh. I believe he beat him twice. I think they fought 40 rounds. He beat him both times in 20 rounders, and a lot of his best wins came before he became champion. Because remember, it took him a while to get the title, to even get a shot, because promoters just plain would not make fights with a black fighter. And so black fighters had to settle for the colored heavyweight championship. That's where Sam McVeigh and Sam Langford and Joe Jeanette, they each had held on to that for a while. And you can't talk about this era without mentioning Clay Moyle's incredible book on Sam Langford, because that really fleshes out more of the era. Those were Jack Johnson's contemporaries. And yes, he fought all of them. Now, the one that I think was is still the question mark that he avoided afterwards was Sam Langford, because I would have loved to see them fight again. Well, to see you know what I mean.
After he was the champion, because they did
right, because they had fought earlier, but even that fight has sort of an asterisk next to it, because Langford weighed, I think, 156.
We got
and
hold on,
like 183. So think about that. That'd be middleweight and a cruiserweight.
Alex, I think we got that. Daxx, can we hear you?
I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, you're breaking up pretty bad, but we got your image. We got your camera shot. But the other fight too, Alex and Daxx, is Joe Jeanette. You mentioned Joe Jeanette, and I believe those were the 3 on your shirt. But Joe Jeanette, 7 times he fought Joe Jeanette, 5 wins, 1 loss, which was a DQ loss, and they had a draw. A great fighter in his own right. When I look through his record quickly, I see some names that stick out to me because of some of the historical aspects of these fighters that I've seen during this era. Denver Ed Martin, Frank Childs, was it Marvin Hart, who was a champion actually. He lost to Marvin Hart. Young Peter Jackson, that's another one. Sam Langford, like you mentioned. Bob Fitzsimmons he beat. And what's just funny about Bob Fitzsimmons, you look at Fitzsimmons at the time when he fought him in 1907, 67 wins, 10 losses, 14 draws, and a guy that was a champion in his own right, and Johnson knocks him out in 2 rounds, and in a scheduled 6-round fight. Al Kaufman, Stanley Ketchel, that's a whole nother story we'll get to. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Tommy Burns, who he won the title from. Fireman Jim Flynn, who he fought a couple of times. Some of them were good and some of them not so good. I mean, he fought everybody that he could during his era. After the James Jeffries, which when he retired, there was no one left, according to the boxing experts, to fight, and that was when Jack Johnson actually got his shot. We lost Daxx, but anyway, your thoughts on some of the fighters he fought, Alex?
Yes, like you mentioned, Jeanette was the other one of his contemporaries that they actually came very close to making the fight a rematch, which was going to be in New York City on a Labor Day weekend, and that would have been huge because it would have been a top 10 challenger, and it would have been two black fighters fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world. In New York City. That would have been great, but it just did not pan out. Now, to me, there wasn't as many questions when you read the history and the fight reports. It seemed like Johnson got the better of Jeanette in a lot of their fights, and like you said, they fought numerous times. However, at that time, Johnson was having a hard time focusing because he was having lots of legal troubles. That's when it was beginning. And Jeanette was, he was like ridiculous in terms of his Spartan-like work ethic. So anybody could have taken advantage.
He was a Ron Lyle. He had the physique of a Ron effing Lyle.
Yeah.
You're right. Sam McVeigh. And he trained. He was a trainer too, right? Didn't he? Wasn't Sam?
Jeanette actually, yeah. He did train guys, and he worked with Willie Lewis, out of New Jersey, and that would have been just a tremendous thing. Of course, Johnson did end up fighting and defending the title against another black fighter, and that was battling Jim Johnson. It went off in Paris because Paris was a little more accepting of black fighters and even entertainers. Josephine Baker had gone there, or was to right around this time. Maybe she was more the 20s and 30s.
So the Jack Johnson, some of the things with him. Let's get into. First of all, Jack Johnson. Here's a guy, and at that time, the whole era is something that has to be taken in consideration. And this is what I think I love the most about Jack Johnson. And there's so many books on him. We touched on a little bit last week, and I've read a countless. I've lost track of how many. As a matter of fact, I found one that I forgot about. It was a little paperback, and it was. I read it real quickly just because it was like a quickie book. It was like a little thinner than my book, but it was cool to read, and it refreshed my memory about a lot of stuff. Like some of my favorite stories about Jack Johnson has to be his attitude generally. First of all, he hated that. And by the time, look, we African Americans, right? There's many times we've referred to African Americans as black and everything else, but in his era, they were Negroes, and he hated the fact that they were considered second-class citizens. And I think it bothered him all the way to I know it bothered him till the day he died. It's what caused his death, but that's another story. We'll get to it. But one of my favorite stories is how arrogant he was about it, and the Oklahoma speeding ticket. This was a guy that loved fast cars, fast women. I mean, he's like everything that you love, well, everything I love about our superstar athletes. He was before it was cool. It was cool when he was doing it, but nobody realized it then. They weren't as cool as him at the time. Even as far as he was the first guy to wear full-length fur coats and stuff. But Jack Johnson, got caught. It's one of my favorite stories. He got caught for speeding. He had a sports car of the time, and you know, you got to keep in mind the era, okay, boys and girls. So a sports car at the time. Today we talk about a sports car that'll do 200 miles an hour. You know, back then not so much. But he had the best car you could have, and he got pulled over. And I believe the state was Oklahoma. And the cop, you know, at that time they would give you tickets, and it wasn't a good thing that he was a black man and he was speeding and he got caught in Oklahoma. And you would think that you know, a guy would mind his P's and Q's, but not Jack Johnson. As the cop came over to him and said, "Yeah, it's a $50 fine," Jack Johnson hands him a $100 bill, and he said, "I told you it's a $50 fine, boy." And Jack Johnson's like, "Well, when I come back, I'm going to be going just as fast, so I figured I'd pay for my ticket." Now, I mean, I remember reading, and I may have paraphrased a little bit, but you know, I remember reading that for the first time, Alex, and I was like, I love this guy. You know, I mean, you know, just as much as I love Tom Molyneux, who would walk down the streets of London in 1809 with two white women on each arm, flaunting that he had them, and nobody bothered him. Jack Johnson was no different here in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's why he became, you know, a larger than life figure. Teresa Runstedler, her book, Jack Johnson, Rebel Sojourner, talks about that. And it even goes so far as to describe how just the international impact.
That was the basis of her book. Her book wasn't so much about him as a fighter. It was him about the international and the way he was perceived, you know, outside of.
Yeah, but that's what you're talking about. Is that idea that he represented in a time where we were America had, because America from its inception, of course, has had this issue with a massive issue with racism. It's a country that's founded on all men are created equal, but don't mention the ones we have in chains. And so, you know, by the time that Lincoln, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law, and actually Galveston, Texas, where Jack Johnson was from, is actually where the Juneteenth holiday, which was just celebrated this week, that actually, I think, was 1865. So it was in the lifetime of his parents. So in that, you know, that it became official that the slaves were free. And here was this black man standing up to white America and white authority and, you know, saying, hey, look at me as an equal. And it was unheard of at the time. And it was, it became a lightning rod for race because, and not only here, like I was saying in that Runstetler book, she talks about how even images of like fight posters in certain nations were banned because they would depict, or fight photos because they would depict Johnson standing over a white opponent. And it became such a powerful image, especially in like colonial Africa, that some of these images were just plain not sold. And the fight films became, that was one of the efforts that was made, was to try to whitewash history, is to not let the copies of the Jeffries Johnson fight, you know, be sold or transported.
Well, just so people understand, they used to film these fights, and that's the other thing. You know, Jack Johnson. We're talking about early 1900s, so a lot of the footage, especially the James Jeffries fight, it was outside. It was a guy cranking a camera, you know, and so I've had people say to me, "Oh man, this guy was slow. He was, you know, how could you say he was so good?" And I'm like, well, you know, you're watching this film that, you know, is 100 and some odd years old, and, you know, guys cranking it. It's 110 degrees in the desert. You know, I mean, you know, You can't.
That's why the fight reports are so important to read.
Well, that's why, from a historical perspective, especially in the sport of boxing, the fight reports are the historical aspect. You remember when I first put my book out and I put it in the book. When I was talking about the book, I get a listener says, "Can you send me some links to YouTube fights of Tom Molyneux?" It's like cameras weren't even invented. But anyway, the thing with Jack Johnson was there's so many things about Jack Johnson, but he didn't want to be treated as a second-class citizen for sure. The James Jeffries fight is a whole nother thing. But the thing about Jack Johnson was it wasn't like just African Americans supported him and white America did not. A lot of black Americans did not support him either. And the reason is because he made life hard on them because of his success. White America at that time would take it out on any other black American that was around. And they felt that he wasn't doing justice. He was, like Daxx said before we lost him, he was ahead of his time because, he was insisting upon equality when his peers, so to speak, were accepting life the way it was. And he was ahead of his time, and I think that's an important thing. But when you get to his championship run, James Jeffries, everybody thought he nobody could beat him. There wasn't a fighter around, and he vacates the title. As a matter of fact, it was so obscure that he actually chose the fighters that would fight for his vacated title. Eventually, Jack Johnson did get the fight with Tommy Burns. He won the world title fight in Australia. He had to go to Australia. And that's when the shit hit the fan, so to speak, because America couldn't deal with the fact that there was a black heavyweight champion. And that's when they started begging James Jeffries to come out of retirement. It even got to the point where people weren't even recognizing Jack Johnson as the world heavyweight champion, Alex, because he didn't beat Jeffries in the ring. And you know as well as anyone that the whole charade, so to speak, of them trying to convince James Jeffries, who at the time was 300 pounds, to leave his retirement on his alfalfa farm with his wife, who he was extremely happy with the whole lifestyle. And he was hounded and hounded and hounded to come save of the white race, come and beat, show this black guy that, and he did. He started training, and it didn't turn out too well for Jeffries, didn't it?
No, it did not. And I think that was one of the things, was that it really, he was, like Daxx said, he was ahead of his time, both in the ring as well as his persona, because that's one of the things you get a lot in the fight reports is he brought science to the game. And especially because some of these fighters, especially in the heavyweight ranks, there wasn't a lot of finesse. They were more bruisers, rough and tumble. Yeah, rough and tumble. And I think that's one of the things that you get a lot in the fight reports is how important infighting is, especially in the heavyweight ranks, and it still is.
Well, Alex, I don't mean to interrupt you, but and we all know what I feel about Floyd Mayweather, but I referred to Jack Johnson last week as the Floyd Mayweather of his time. And what I meant by that was, and I actually should have used Sugar Ray Robinson because I thought he was much better defensively, or Lomachenko, Vasily Lomachenko, to me, modern times is probably one of the best defensive fighters around. But Jack Johnson, you couldn't hit him. It was sort of like a cat. I remember reading, I don't know which book I read, but he was just, it might have been Papa Jack. That was actually my favorite Jack Johnson book. But they describe him fighting opponents as a cat toying with a mouse that they know that is already kind of halfway dead. You know what I mean? And he was so much better that his fights actually, a lot of those reports, if you read between the lines, weren't exciting. They weren't exciting because he was so much better than his opponents. I mean, the James Jeffries fight was exciting because of the fanfare, but the fight itself was a beatdown.
Yeah, and that's one that you can watch much of it on YouTube. And yeah, there's a lot of clinching, and I think that's one of the things that because remember at this time, Joe Gans, Barbados Joe Walcott, those were also two other great black fighters. Gans a lightweight, Walcott a welter, and who were having incredible success, and stylistically were more defensive minded than a lot of their white contemporaries. Like you said, I mean, I think once you get to the heavyweight division, you couple that with the fact that he's just physically imposing. I mean, he enjoyed a significant size advantage to Tommy Burns and Marvin Hart. Both those guys were smallish, and that's who Burns had won the championship when Marvin Hart was sort of dubbed the top contender by Jim Jeffries. So it is one of those things that there was almost this like transitional, the heavyweight championship was almost a fraternity, and in comes Jack Johnson, and yeah, with this different kind of style, and it looks very different, and of course that's what gave people a lot of problems in the time. But yeah, I mean, just physically strong, because you even see this in the Jeffries fight. He's able to outmuscle Jeff. And at one point, I remember in one of the documentaries, it's Jimmy Jacobs narrating it, talking about that, how he's able to sort of push his arms, right behind him. And if you think about that, it's, I don't know, that's one of the things that why reading about it is so much, because it's so much more impactful, because when you watch it, you're not getting the same effect. Even today, if you watch certain angles, it's not the same as when you get every angle. And like you said, the cameras were nothing like we have today.
It was one camera.
You need to read something of people with educated eyes describing what they just saw. Because when you read that, they're always blown away. And if they're blown away, they're seeing something, Well, the one thing that stands out, and I think the James Jeffries fight, although it had significance in terms of, the fight game and society and what have you, but I think what I have always gotten out of that fight was the difference of the type of skill levels that we saw. James Jeffries was and I'm not knocking James Jeffries at all, because he was, unmatched during his time until he fought Jack Johnson. But James Jeffries was that last rough and tumble style fighter, the guy, I'm not going to say similar to Sullivan, but along those lines, power you down and beat you to submission. Jack Johnson, on the other hand, was, in my opinion, the beginning of what we refer to today as the sweet science. This guy was hard to hit. This guy knew the secret of proper distance and, keeping your opponent at bay. And all of these things at that time, based on the style of fighting that they were doing at that time, made him boring in a sense. Again, ahead of his time. But there was nobody equal to him. And he proved that by his, demolishment, if that's a word, of James Jeffries. But then after that fight, and they wouldn't even let him
actually knock him out. The police came and stopped the fight before he was totally unconscious. I mean, he was hanging on the ropes.
No, that was Burns. Jeffries was the one his handlers pick him up and sort of go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, but they did stop the fight. They didn't let
eventually, but I think he gets dropped 3 times.
Yeah, no, he was dropped a bunch of times, but the police stopped that fight. That fight was stopped.
Oh, because the Tommy Burns one, they literally stopped they stopped the cameras, everything. You don't see the actual intervention because they tell the cameraman stop rolling.
Right. Well, with the James Jeffries fight, it was similar. They didn't want him to be, especially because they thought that they were going to be showing that film in the movie theaters. They didn't want him to be shown getting knocked out, which you brought up earlier about those films, which a lot of them, Jack Johnson was supposed to get a big cut of that revenue of the films. And because they didn't show them as much as they were supposed to, he didn't make out financially the way he should have. James Jeffries, I think, made out way better financially than Jack Johnson.
Wow. That's not surprising.
No. But Jack Johnson is a lot more than a former heavyweight champion. Did you know? You know, he's patented a couple of things. His name, one of his famous patents, was patent 1413121, which I'm sure you know, was a wrench that he patented in 1922, April 18th to be exact.
Now, and when he was in the clink after because once he lost to Willard, he came back to the U.S. and then he did have to serve some time in a federal penitentiary, and I think that's where he got the patents, wasn't it?
No, he actually turned himself in 1920. We'll get to that about the Mann Act, which just always pisses me off every time I think of that. But he turned himself in 1920. Okay. All right. So I got ahead of myself. So he becomes a champion, right, boys and girls? And back at that time, they didn't make as many defenses as you would think, because being a heavyweight champion was you made your money outside of the ring. They all did. So he paraded on, and World War I was breaking out, and all these things. And then the Mann Act. So in case you don't know about the Mann Act, it was a law that was placed where if you transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, it was illegal. You'd get arrested for that. And he did that. He was a ladies' man, and he liked to hang out with ladies of the night sometimes. And he was arrested for doing that. And he was accused and transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. Lucille Cameron, who he ended up marrying. This is my problem with this. He marries him, and they tried to have her turn against him to throw him in jail. Remember, white America didn't want this guy to do anything. All they wanted to do was throw him in a jail cell and bury the key. She refused to testify. So that particular case fell apart. But no, wait, there's more, because Belle Schreiber, another one of his female companions, decided that she would testify against him, and they convicted him of that. Your thoughts, Alex? I got to plug in my battery before I lose my computer.
Yeah, it was definitely it was a case of just blatant persecution. They wanted to get him. And, the thing about this, the law, now granted, a lot of, in a lot of places, interracial marriage in this country was just plain illegal. So that was part of some of the history with this rule, with this law. However, it has been used recently. It was used, I think, to Elliot Spitzer, I think, was convicted under the Mann Act.
Oh, I thought that was driving a helicopter illegally.
Well, because it's definitely one of those, America, we always have, Jack Johnson gets the story, two huge American things, race and sex. And
Elliot,
both.
Listen, Mr. Politico, you bring up Elliot Spitzer, right? He was the guy that they first busted him for using a helicopter for his after governing activities.
Oh, well, see, that would be, because you could probably easily cross state lines in a helicopter. See,
but I didn't know there was no line when I was looking down from the helicopter. Anyway, Jack Johnson gets convicted, right? He hightails it out of here, and he goes through Canada and leaves the country. He ends up in France, right? This is where it starts to get a little dicey for him. He was living very extravagantly. He had a lot of money. He did fight a few times. He got a couple of terrible fights in Paris, especially in 1914 against Frank Moran. He came in the heaviest of his career, I believe it was 221 pounds. Or around that, and the referee was Carpentier, the former champion. He became homesick after he was on the run for a couple of years. He missed his mom. His mom was ill during his riches. He bought her a house in Chicago, and he wanted to come home. And this is where it starts to get a little shady, Alex, because this is when you start thinking of all the different versions of the story. Jess Willard was the big giant, and his manager, Jack Curley, according to multiple reports, approached Jack Johnson. They agreed to a deal where he would take a dive in that fight in Havana, and he would be granted, he wouldn't do time in Leavenworth. And the photo of Jack Johnson after he got knocked out, or they claim he was knocked out, and he was well over the hill at this point, 37 years old, lying on his back. And it does appear from the photos, Alex, that he was shielding the sun from his eyes. He did get up right after. It was extremely hot. They referred to it as a sauna ringside. What's your thoughts on all the different versions of that?
Yeah, I would love to believe that that was the case, that the only way to come back to America to see his dying mother was if he was not champion. And so he agreed to throw the fight to the much, his inferior Jess Willard, and he was willing to give up the championship and come back to America. However, there's even Sam McVeigh, who's one of my favorites, does an interview with Damon Runyon, the writer, because back then you would go from Havana by boat, I guess, to Florida, and then from Florida you go back, by train. And so he talks to Runyon on the train, and he claimed that he had sparred with Jack Johnson and even sparred with him the week of the fight. That's the sort of different time this was, because they would never do that now, that risk of being cut. And he claimed Johnson had nothing. So, and never would Johnson be beatable by a guy like Willard. Now, remember, that was 26 rounds, like you said, in like 105-degree Havana heat. One of the theories, and again, if you believe the conspiracy, you have to have because you have to fill in all the gaps to have it make sense. The reason why it took so long was because Johnson was waiting for his girlfriend to give him a signal. She got the cash.
That's right. That she got the cash on ringside.
Right. And then once he got that, then he went down. Now, I don't know. I think the thing about Jess Willard is he was a tough, strong, big guy. Because remember, when Jack Dempsey beats the hell out of him,
destroys
that first round,
7 knockdowns.
Took 3 more rounds to finally finish him. So the guy was durable. If you give him anything, and 26 rounds in a van of heat, he's got to be durable. So I don't know. And years later, supposedly everything McVeigh said to Runyon, I forget, either he recanted it somewhere or Runyon claimed, yeah, that was all just promotional. I forget, but somewhere I've read or heard maybe it was up in Canastota where somebody said, no, that was all BS.
Yeah, I had remember hearing that it was promotional, and Sam McVeigh eventually had admitted that down the line. But you bring up Jack Dempsey. Okay, so Jack Johnson loses his title. He does hang around for 2 more years before he comes back. And yes, he ended up doing his time in Leavenworth, in which he made some money because he fought another 5 or 6 fights at Leavenworth, which people say were exhibitions, but others say they weren't, that they were real entertaining fights.
Can you imagine? I bet that was fun as hell to see that. He probably, can you imagine him fighting in a prison yard?
Bro,
if you're one of the inmates, you got Jack Johnson.
Well, James, listen,
that was a fun day.
Listen, growing up, being a boxing fan and then watching it, I mean, I'll forever remember James Scott fighting in New Jersey, and we almost had James Scott on this show, but he wasn't mentally able to do a show when they finally released him. But anyway,
there's actually, I'm sorry,
his brother.
There's actually you could find that on YouTube where I think it's NBC Sports.
It was
like Al Albert or Steve Albert going into Rawway. It's awesome.
I remember watching it with the inmates right there. They're
all looking over the shoulder,
and it was great. And he was a legitimate fighter. We're off topic here, but he was a legitimate fighter until he lost, and then that was the end. Then but whatever. But Jack Johnson, he ends up doing his time. He fights a bunch of fights, and by this time, he starts trying to campaign for a shot at Jack Dempsey, which never materialized. A couple of other things that I'll mention is that he did try to become the trainer of Joe Louis, which is interesting in its own right. But because, and we talked about this last week when we talked about Joe Louis, but because Joe Louis was trying to be brought up to be not at all like Jack Johnson, they didn't want Jack Johnson in the corner. And that pissed Jack Johnson off. For sure, and he never did get the fight with Dempsey. After he got back into the ring, so to speak, he did fight some fights. Nothing really materialized into anything. I mean, he started fighting the same guys a few times. Never got his title shot at all with Jack Dempsey. But a couple of interesting things, like I mentioned, I jumped the gun about his patent, which was in 1922. He developed a wrench. It was like an adjustable wrench before its time. And a couple of things that stuck out to me, which got him the patent, which is registered with the U.S. Patent Office officially April 18th of 1922, when he was describing it in order to get it. He said, "This wrench will provide an improved wrench which is of simple and durable construction, reliable in operation, and easy and very inexpensive to manufacture, which may be easily and readily adjusted and which would adapt to exert a powerful gripping action upon the work. If you punch it up and look at it, it's U.S. patent number 1413121. You'll see it kind of looks like a plumber's adjustable wrench. Kind of looks similar along that, almost like a crescent, like a beginning version of a crescent wrench. And he had another patent as well, but he wasn't a dumb guy. He was an extremely intelligent guy, but his death haunts me, Alex. And I think his death puts everything in perspective, because he was also in a film. He was in some silent films as well. So, I mean, this guy made his way around, and all the endless books we touched on last week about his own autobiography. He was more of a superhero than anything else. I mean, I love that one. And it was originally published in French, and it had to be converted to English. But the thing that haunts me is the death and everything surrounding it. So basically, as the story goes, he was I believe he was 68 years old, and he was in North Carolina, and he went to a diner with his buddy, and they walk into this diner to get a bite to eat, and they wouldn't serve him because they were black, and his friend was basically hey, let's just go. And Jack Johnson was pissed off. And, we talked earlier about how he loved fast cars. He gets in his car and he started driving like a maniac, lost control of his car in North Carolina and smashed into a telephone pole. This took place on June 10th in 1946. The worst part of the story is that they took him to a black hospital. Okay. And boys and girls, this, we have a lot of racism going on today, and racial tensions today are pretty bad. At least the worst that I've seen in my lifetime. But consider this. Jack Johnson was involved in this automobile accident. They hit a telephone pole. Granted, the cars were built a lot better then, but you're never going to win a battle against, a telephone pole. They put him in an ambulance. There was a hospital less than 5 miles away. However, they didn't serve black patients. So Jack Johnson had to be transported via ambulance to a black hospital. And that was 25 miles away. And Jack Johnson was in that ambulance for that time, which vehicles didn't travel as quickly as they do today. Roads weren't as passable as they are today. So I could only imagine that a 25-mile ride did not take 25 minutes or a half hour as it would today. And it took more like 40 minutes or even closer to an hour. They get him on the operating table, and he died. Nobody knew who he was, which amazes me, except the doctor who pronounced him dead. And he said, "This is Jack Johnson. The world just lost the greatest fighter ever." And, it's always haunted me, Alex, that the way Jack Johnson died. I mean, considering, how many people loved him or hated him, I don't think he deserved a death like that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things about our sport is that there is, as much as there's moments where you are just the king of everything, the king of the world. There's an virtual anonymity, even in the death, because that's stunning, because that's sad, but it shows you the doctor did recognize him. So it's sort of he didn't pass into obscurity.
Yeah, but he kind of did.
Just about, yeah. Just about.
And it just we owed him more. The sport owed him more than,
Yeah,
than the
yeah,
way. And I know we could say that about a lot of fighters, but Jack Johnson is above a lot of them. I mean, you and I both love Mike Tyson. Who was one of his favorite fighters? Jack Johnson. You know,
yeah, and I think he's definitely getting more. I think Jack Johnson today gets more respect than he did at his time, and I think that's cool. I mean, because I think when you think about and especially just to talk about race, if you think of the most influential, both in terms of sport and American culture, it would definitely have to be the three heavyweight champions that for me come to mind, and each one of them it was so interwoven with America's racial relationship with Black America is Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, and Muhammad Ali. And
I mean, at least Muhammad Ali came at a time when his voice was heard. Jack Johnson, it seems, was on deaf ears, you know?
Well, and I think, Jack Johnson, I think definitely, because both Johnson and Ali suffered persecution, but exile, but I think it was for different reasons and for very different reasons, if you think about it.
Very different. I mean, there are no similar reasons.
Well, no, there definitely was, because part of the fact that Ali, this is how dare this Black man say these things about American militarism?
Yeah, but the thing with Ali was that people perceive whether the intent was there or not. We don't know, but the way the perception was that he was trying to come up with a religion reason why he didn't want to go to war. That's the way people thought of it with the draft and everything else. Jack Johnson was being persecuted just because of the color of his skin.
He was, yeah.
You know, so I mean, and I'm not downplaying Muhammad Ali's persecution at all. I'm just saying it was totally different. You know, the thing, and you're right. I'm glad you made the point about the respect, because you're right, and I hope Jack Johnson is looking down on it now and appreciates it to a degree, but. There was one thing, and I remember uncovering it during the show, that there was a comic made, I don't know if it was just a strip or a comic book about Jack Johnson's life in the 2000s. It's more recently. I got to dig it up. I know.
Book. Yeah, there's a children's book.
It wasn't children's book. This was.
Well, maybe there's also a comic, but there's definitely a children's book. I got a copy for the place where I tutor, that I volunteer. I can't remember the name of it, but
this was a comic book series, though.
Really?
It was an artist that started putting it out, and it was a modern flair of the drawings of the comics themselves, and they were actually making Jack Johnson in more of a modern era. I got to dig it up. I'm going to find it because it was cool, and I started trying to get it, and it fizzled out, the comic itself. But it was not a children's book. Definitely not. The way it was written and the drawings, and it was a lot of his escapades with women and stuff. So it was clearly not.
This one is the one that I saw is a children's book. They kind of, I forget how they talk about.
How do they make Jack Johnson a children's book?
Yeah. Well, I don't think they don't talk too much about the Mann Act.
Yeah. But anyway, listen, boys and girls, Jack Johnson, great fighter. This is what we're trying to do with the show. Just open up some discussion on these great fighters. Hopefully, feel free to drop me an email and discuss it more, and we'd love to hear from you. I want to tell you about next week. Next week we're going to do our show on another one of my favorite fighters. You see the trend here, Alex? A lot of my favorite fighters. It's sort of like my baseball. I get to pitch, right? But
that's it. There you go.
This is cool. Sonny Liston is one of my favorite fighters. Well, we got a guy that's going to join us next week, who put out this book, The Real Story Behind Sonny Liston. And his name is Paul Gallender. And we tried to get him on earlier, and just some things didn't work out. But he's agreed to come on. And he's going to – this guy knows everything about Sonny Liston, another one of my favorite fighters. I can't wait to talk to him about Sonny Liston. And that's going to be here next week. So I'm really looking forward to that. Any final thoughts from my main man, Alex?
I think Jack Johnson's one of my favorites. I was real psyched to have gotten that stand-up of Jack at the.
Where is it? Where is it? With the cat taking it down?
Yeah, I'm in a different room, actually. I should have done it in front of it. I should have brought this laptop up there. But he, I mean, I do think that I don't know. It's hard to sum him up but I do think that, it was great to see that he was pardoned. I do think that, it could have gone a different way if maybe a different president did it, but I'm glad that it got done. That was cool because I think that he, deserved that. And I think actually thinking about it, if you think about persecution, in a way, all three of those fighters were persecuted by the U.S. government in a way, because Joe Louis was persecuted by the IRS.
Coach, my man Coach sent me an article which I had never heard. I'm going to bring it up because we talked about Joe Louis last week. And
today actually is the anniversary of the knockout of Schmeling.
Is it? I didn't even realize that. Oh, that's
June
cool.
22nd, 1938.
That's cool. He brought up to me that everything we've heard about that isn't necessarily true. That they did cut a deal with him, and that the fights would have been the money owed with the government would have been a wash, but the management screwed him again. And so as much as we blame the IRS, which I still do, and I appreciate Coach's link to the article I read.
Coach stood up for the IRS?
No, Coach didn't stand up for the IRS. He was saying that it wasn't as much as the IRS's fault as his own management that kind of screwed him, and that he owed money from many other fights, not just the war effort fights, that he was not being advised to pay his taxes all along, which is very, I mean, that happens to this day. I mean, absolutely. Why do you think Floyd Mayweather is fighting punching bags to pay his taxes? But he's not. But he's not smart enough to realize that, he's going to have to keep fighting to pay the previous fight's taxes. But that's another show. But in any event, I'm looking forward to the Sonny Liston thing. Love Jack Johnson. Wish he got more credit. And the one thing that bothers me the most, and I'll leave us with this, is that today's boxing fan and a lot of these shows, and I don't mean to bash on today's boxing fan, but a lot of you young whippersnappers, Alex brought it up earlier in the show, both Alex and myself, and he's much more well-read than I will ever be. But the truth of the matter is sometimes before cameras and video and YouTube, the only way that you could get the version of a story is by actually reading about it. And although there were many different versions of fight coverage and stuff, that's actually the beauty of it. And I know that's what I've always loved. And I would bet my last nickel that Alex feels the same way, that to read multiple versions of the same fight and to get different, newspaper decisions, we're off topic, but newspaper decisions were exactly that. If Alex and I were fighting, and my hometown is Lake George, New York, and Alex is in where's your hometown? I was going to say New Haven, but anyway, if a reporter from New Haven was reporting on the fight and his version of the story was Alex kicked the shit out of me for 10 rounds, and my reporter from New York said I kicked the shit out of Alex for 10 rounds, you would have two different newspaper verdicts. The one from Alex's hometown would say he won the fight, and the one from my hometown would say I won the fight. So that's the way the record books are, because fights weren't legal. So a newspaper decision was the opinion of the guy covering the fight. And that was a big thing. So you had to read multiple versions of the fights to get a full picture of how those fights happened. Today, a lot of fight fans would never do that. They don't read on anything. Their opinion is if I can't see it. And that was the argument that was presented to me many, many times about Jack Johnson specifically, because they watched the big fight that's on video, which is the James Jeffries fight, which Alex and I talked about earlier, which was in early 1900s, with a one guy cranking the camera, and it was out in the desert. That was a fight in Goldfield, Nevada, right?
No, that was
Joe Gans.
Yes, this was Reno.
Reno, right. They built the stadium for this fight. They had people coming in by rail car for days ahead. They had one guy filming it, one guy, standing on a pedestal, cranking that camera. And I hear people today tell me, he wasn't fast. He wasn't this. He was slow. He was this. Well, you don't have high definition video.
It's not 4K video.
And the thing is today your cell phone could take 10 to 100, 1,000 times better quality video, not even trying. If you drop it and the camera kicks off and it takes a video of the ceiling, it's a better quality than what these guys are. So you have to put it in perspective, and you actually have to flip through pages of print to get it. And I think, Alex, I hope you and I aren't the last of the people that enjoy that, but it's why I watch old movies, black and white movies. It's all I watch these days, Turner Classic Movie Channel, because your imagination sometimes is more horrific than the most gory horror film, like The Family Secret. Hey, let me tell you something. Do you know? Hey, all right. Before we go, I'll tell you, my man. Listen, I love Alex. He's like the son I never wanted. But Alex was a star in a movie, right? Do you know that there's another movie called The Family Secret, and it was put out in the 50s?
Really?
Do you know that?
I think there had been more than one family secret. Yeah.
I think the difference is maybe it's Family Secret and The Family Secret, because you can't.
Go.
No. Dude, I'm 100. When we get off the air, I'm going to tell you. But there is. It was put out in like 1951 or something.
Wow. I think that it now has been re-released, and it has a new name, but I can't remember what the new name is. Something Slasher, I forget.
If you guys haven't seen Alex Papali's starring role in The Family Secret, you got to buy that video now. But
contact me. I'll get you an autographed DVD.
Yeah, I'll get you an autographed.
And even those, I have a whole box of DVDs. Nobody buys DVDs.
Hey, you know what? When I watched it, and of course, I'm supportive of anything Alex does. And I watched it, and I wish I was involved. It was interesting.
It was a lot of fun.
It's a must-see movie. So for all you guys out there, you got to see my man Alex starring in The Family Secret. But in any event, we will be back better than ever next week, and we will be talking about another one of my favorite fighters, Sonny Liston. Special guest joining us will be Paul Gallinger, and he will tell us. I can't wait to ask him what his actual thoughts are on the death of the late great Sonny Liston. Alex, final
One thing I think I have that book. I want to see if there's anything because I actually saw. I'll send you the link. I saw some footage today of Gerald McClellan sparring with James Toney from 1990. It's amazing. And I heard that I think I've read more than once that Liston and Foreman sparred at some point. So
I never heard that. I never heard that.
Yeah, I've heard.
Interesting. Well, another question. Right, jot down the questions for Paul.
Yeah, because that'd be awesome. Imagine. Woof.
Yeah.
Scary.
All right, boys and girls, make sure you tune in next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Until then, ciao, baby.